Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? Bryn Takakota sat at the edge of the long steel table, hands folded, eyes on the wall where mission charts were pinned in neat rows. The air in the room buzzed with small talk, names, assignments, the scrape of chairs. But she was invisible in it. 8 months back on U.S. soil, and she still hadn't learned how to belong to the noise again. Someone across the table laughed. Another tossed a pen and muttered about who had to clean the armory next. She smiled faintly, polite but distant. There were things she didn't say anymore, stories that didn't fit in casual conversation. The part of her that had once belonged to the teams was buried under paperwork, briefings, and the kind of silence that follows people who have seen too much. Outside, the California sun burned through the windows, bleaching the walls pale. She blinked against the glare and tried to focus on the routine, liaise with logistics, update readiness reports, check comms inventory. All of it necessary, none of it her. They didn't know who she really was. Not the sailors she passed in the corridor. Not the junior officers who nodded at her like she was a desk officer. Not even the recruits who strutted through the base pretending they already wore tridents. And she preferred it that way, mostly. But there was a loneliness that came with hiding the thing you'd bled for. She finished her notes, closed the folder, and stood. It was Tuesday, another long day of reports. The mess hall would be crowded by now, full of young energy and laughter. She considered skipping dinner, but hunger won. The hum of conversation hit her as soon as she walked in. The smell of coffee, starch, sweat, metal trays clattering against the counter. For a moment she just stood there, scanning faces. No one looked up. She liked it that way. Bryn moved to the line, took a tray, and filled it mechanically. Rice, chicken, a side of greens she wouldn't eat. Her uniform was crisp, her posture perfect, but she carried herself like someone who wanted to disappear. She found an empty table near the corner and sat. Then it happened. 5 men entered, young, loud, full of the swagger that came with surviving the first brutal weeks of Bud S. Their laughter sliced through the noise of the room. She didn't look up, but she felt them notice her. The pause in conversation, the slight shift in tone. One of them said something low, another laughed. She knew that rhythm, the rising pack energy before someone made a mistake. The tallest of them broke from the group, broad shoulders, shaved head, a certain kind of confidence born from never having failed hard enough yet. He walked straight toward her table, tray swinging at his side. The others followed. "Hey," he said, stopping in front of her. "You lost, ma'am." His tone wasn't curious, it was testing. Bryn looked up slowly, her expression stayed even. "No, I'm right where I need to be." A smirk tugged at his mouth. "This section's usually for operators. Admin eats over there." He nodded toward the far tables. His friends chuckled behind him. Bryn's fork hovered over her plate. "You should move along, candidate." He tilted his head. "Candidate, huh? You don't look like anyone I've seen in training. You sure you know what that word means?" Another voice chimed in higher, mocking. "She's probably intel or supply. You know, the kind that files reports about real missions." A third added, "Or morale support. Bet she's good at that." The laughter rolled out again, and something in her chest went very still. Not anger, not even surprise. Just the old, tired recognition. She'd heard it before, at Coronado in training, even in combat zones when men forgot professionalism under fatigue. It wasn't personal, it was cultural, but that didn't make it less exhausting. Her grandfather's voice drifted up from memory, calm and low. "Don't waste breath proving yourself to fools, little hawk. Wait, let them show you who they are first." She set her fork down quietly and rose. The movement silenced the nearest tables. At 5'6", she didn't look imposing, but there was a density to her presence, like something coiled, waiting. "You've got 5 seconds to walk away," she said. Her voice was soft but carried, even through the mess hall din. "After that, this becomes your problem." The Texan laughed, a full, bright sound that showed too much confidence. "You're gonna make it my problem." He took a step closer. The others moved with him, forming a loose half-circle. Someone behind them muttered, "Oh, this I gotta see." She waited, counted the breaths. 1, 2, 3. Then his hand came up, mock casual, reaching toward her shoulder. The world narrowed to a tunnel. Her right hand shot up, deflecting his arm sideways. In the same movement, she pivoted, weight on the ball of her left foot, and drove her elbow into his solar plexus. The sound that came out of him wasn't a word. It was air and shock and disbelief. He folded. The second one lunged, trying to grab her around the waist. She sidestepped, hooked his arm, and twisted, used his momentum to throw him down hard. The crash of his body on tile rang across the room. Another came from behind. She dropped low, turned, and struck the nerve just above his knee with a sharp, surgical precision. His leg buckled. He went down gasping. The fourth hesitated. The fifth froze. Bryn straightened, breathing steady, eyes flat and focused. It had taken maybe 30 seconds. Someone dropped a fork somewhere across the room. The metallic ping echoed. Then came a voice, older, steady, authoritative. "That's enough." Senior Chief Garrett Moss stepped forward from the serving line, arms crossed. His face was unreadable. He'd been around long enough to know exactly what he'd seen. He looked at the recruits on the floor, then at Bryn. "Lieutenant, your rank and community." "Lieutenant Bryn Takakota," she said quietly. "Naval Special Warfare SEAL." The silence that followed was heavy. Moss's eyes softened a fraction. "Noted," he said finally. Then to the recruits, "You 5 command duty office. 5 minutes, move." They scrambled up, limping, stunned. The Texan's face had gone pale. When they were gone, Moss looked back at her. "You okay, ma'am?" "I'm fine." He studied her a moment longer. "I was at Bud S when you graduated. Class 312, right?" She nodded. "I remember that class." His voice carried a trace of respect. "Shouldn't have had to happen." She gave a small shrug. "It's fine, Senior Chief." But it wasn't fine, not really. It was just familiar. That night, alone in her quarters, she replayed the scene. Not the fight, but the look on their faces when they realized what she was. It wasn't the shock that lingered. It was the pity. The kind that said you shouldn't have to prove it this way. She sat on the edge of her bunk, boots off, staring at the trident patch folded inside her drawer. She'd kept it there ever since returning from Syria, out of sight, away from questions. Maybe hiding had been easier than fighting perceptions every day. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it, the gold catching light from the desk lamp. The metal was cool against her fingers. She remembered earning it, the freezing surf of Coronado, the sand grinding into every pore of her skin, the instructors' voices breaking the night. She remembered the moment they pinned it to her chest. No applause, no speech, just quiet pride. She whispered to herself, "You still have it." But the question that followed hit harder. Why are you still hiding it? Morning came early. Base security had taken statements. The recruits were handed over to their instructors. She expected fallout, rumors, jokes, whispers, but none came. Instead, an official call from the commanding officer's office. When she entered, Commander Dalton was behind his desk, Moss standing to the side. Both looked up. "Lieutenant Takakota," Dalton said, gesturing to a chair. "Sit." She did. He spoke evenly, professional. "We've reviewed the incident. 2 candidates are being dropped from training for conduct unbecoming. The rest have been disciplined." Bryn nodded once. Dalton's gaze lingered. "There's another matter. Your personnel record. Why is your SEAL qualification not listed under active assignment?" She hesitated. "I wanted to do the work without the noise, sir." "The noise?" "The attention, the explanation, the assumptions." Dalton leaned back, fingers steepled. "You earned something most never will. That's not noise, that's legacy." Moss spoke quietly. "Ma'am, I reviewed your deployment records. Syria, Iraq. You were recommended for a Bronze Star." Bryn looked down. "The team earned that, not me." Dalton's voice softened. "The report says you saved 3 men when your convoy was ambushed near Deir ez-Zor. That's not nothing." She said nothing. The silence stretched, thick with things unspoken, losses, fatigue, the quiet burden of survival. Finally Dalton said, "I think it's time you stopped hiding, Lieutenant. The Navy needs operators who can handle themselves under pressure. You've proven you're one of them." Moss added, "There's a slot opening on SEAL Team 3, if you want it." Her throat tightened. 8 months of restraint cracked a little. She thought of her grandfather again, of his weathered hands guiding hers on the rifle, his words echoing through years of training. "Respect is earned in silence, Bryn. Let your actions speak." She took a slow breath. "I'd like that, sir." Dalton smiled, a rare thing. "Then I'll start the paperwork." When she left the office, the sun was just rising over Coronado. She walked across the tarmac alone, the wind carrying salt and jet fuel. For the first time in months, she didn't lower her gaze when sailors passed. She didn't need to. Inside her chest, something steady returned, a pulse of belonging, quiet but alive. And somewhere, in the memory of an old Marine who once called her Little Hawk, there was the faint echo of approval. Sometimes redemption doesn't arrive with applause. It comes in a moment of stillness, after the fight, when you finally stop hiding from your own shadow. Why did she hesitate at the hangar door that first morning? Bryn Takakota stood just outside the steel entrance of SEAL Team 3's compound, the California wind pushing faint salt air into her lungs. She'd been in dozens of briefings, crossed airfields in war zones, moved through compounds under fire. But this felt different. The metallic clang of tools, the sharp echo of boots on concrete, the smell of oil and sweat, all of it hit her like a memory of a world she'd almost lost. She thought she was ready, but walking back into a team space after months behind a desk was like stepping into a version of herself she'd tried to bury. The rhythm here was faster, harder, alive with competition and silent hierarchy, and she knew how easily a wrong word, a misstep, could shift everything. She adjusted her cover, took one slow breath and walked in. Heads turned. Conversations paused for a heartbeat, then resumed, lower, measured. She recognized the looks, not open hostility, not yet, but calculation. Who is she? Why is she here? Can she pull her weight? Commander Ramirez emerged from his office, tall and steady, eyes sharp from years of dust and fire. "Lieutenant Takakota," he said, voice even. "Welcome to Team 3. You'll shadow me this week, then take over as assistant patrol leader." She nodded, tone clipped. "Yes, sir." Ramirez studied her a beat longer, then offered a faint nod. "You'll earn your place fast here. Just remember, out there, rank matters less than trust." "I understand." She did. Trust was currency, it was everything, and she'd been broke for months. The next days blurred into a rhythm of drills, weapons checks, PT before dawn. She kept her distance, observing, learning the unspoken dynamics between the men. The way they joked about exhaustion, the silent rituals before training dives, the precise way they prepped gear without words. Some ignored her completely. Others tested her with polite condescension, tiny comments disguised as banter. "Need help with that ruck, ma'am? You sure you want to go full weight? No shame in taking it easy first week." She let it all roll off. The quiet endurance was familiar. It was how she'd survived Bud S. But nights were harder. Alone in her quarters, she felt the ache creep back, the one that started after Syria. The ache that came from remembering too much. The dust storms, the gunfire, the child crying in a village they couldn't save. She buried it all beneath work. But returning to an operational team peeled it open again. Sleep came late. When it did, it was shallow and restless. On the fourth morning, Ramirez called the team to the range. "Reflex shoot, moving targets, low light," he said. "We'll see what you've got." Bryn checked her MK-18 carbine, fingers moving automatically. When it was her turn, she stepped into the lane. The lights dimmed. The targets popped up, shapes, silhouettes, some hostile, some friendly. Her breathing slowed, memory taking over. Each squeeze of the trigger was precise, deliberate, almost surgical. She flowed through the drill without hesitation, transitions smooth, no wasted motion. When the lights came back up, the instructor called out, "0 misses." A low whistle broke the silence. Someone muttered, "Damn." Ramirez didn't smile, but his eyes flickered, respect quietly earned. "All right, Lieutenant," he said. "Noted." She exhaled, a small knot in her chest loosening. That night the mess hall felt different. One of the younger operators nodded at her as she passed. Another made room at the table. Small gestures, but real. She sat with them, said little, listened more. The conversation turned to past deployments, Djibouti, Iraq, the endless rotations that blurred together. Someone asked, "Where were you before this?" She hesitated. "Syria, liaison team." "Before that?" "Iraq, direct action task force." The table went quiet for a beat. They hadn't expected that answer. Ramirez, sitting 2 seats down, broke the silence. "I read the file. You pulled 2 men out of a kill zone near Deir ez-Zor. That's not liaison work." She met his eyes. "It was a bad night." He nodded slowly. "We've all had those." And just like that, the wall thinned. Not vanished, but thinned enough for air to pass through. Days turned into weeks. She became part of the rhythm again. The pre-dawn runs along the beach, the gear checks before operations, the easy banter that masked fatigue. And beneath it all, a strange calm grew. The feeling of belonging, not because anyone said she did, but because she'd stopped asking for permission. Still, the ghosts didn't leave. One evening, while cleaning her weapon, she caught herself staring at her reflection in the metal, eyes darker than she remembered. A flash of Syria cut through her mind. The alleyway, the sudden burst of gunfire, the dust exploding around her. A teammate yelling for cover. She, moved without thinking, dragged him behind a wall, returned fire. The smell of burnt powder never left her nose after that. She blinked it away. The past was a shadow she couldn't shake, but maybe, if she kept moving, it would stop following so closely. Ramirez called for a full team meeting that night. "New op," he said. "Horn of Africa, counterterrorism advisory mission. Will be embedded with host nation forces. Minimal visibility, high volatility." The words settled heavy. Bryn's stomach tightened. She missed the field, yes, but the field came with ghosts. Ramirez caught her glance. "You good, Takakota?" "Yes, sir." She meant it, or tried to. Deployment prep began fast. Logistics, coordination, endless lists. Bryn handled most of the comms gear and Overwatch assignments. She double-checked every line, every frequency. It was easier to focus on what she could control. The flight to Africa was long and silent. The C-17 hummed with vibration. The team dozed, faces lit by dim red cabin light. Bryn sat awake, staring at the cargo straps, letting memories blur into noise. When they landed, the heat hit like a wall, thick, dusty, full of insects and distant diesel fumes. The camp was little more than tents and a single prefab building. The nights were filled with the sound of generators and far-off gunfire. First week went smooth, joint patrols, intel gathering, training locals. She kept to herself, working quietly, earning trust the only way that mattered, competence. Until the night everything went sideways. They were wrapping up an advisory session when intel came through, high-value targets spotted in a nearby village. Ramirez looked at her. "You're on Overwatch. Small team, quick in and out." She nodded, loading gear. No hesitation. The insertion was smooth, low moon, barely any light. The team moved like shadows through scrub and dust. Bryn positioned herself on a ridge overlooking the compound. Thermal picked up movement. 2 hostiles near the door, one on the roof. She called it in quietly. Then, without warning, the world lit up. Heavy machine gun fire tore through the night. The first round struck near her position, kicking up dirt. The radio filled with shouting. "Contact north side, technical mounted gun." Bryn dropped behind a rock outcrop, sighted through the scope. The muzzle flash was bright too close. She adjusted, exhaled, fired. The gunner dropped. The weapon swung wild before going still. More rounds cracked overhead. She switched to short bursts, calling out positions, keeping her tone calm even as adrenaline surged. "Target down, 2 remaining, shifting left." Her voice never shook. Training took over. Air support came 3 minutes later. The chaos ended as fast as it started. When silence fell again, her hands were trembling, not from fear, from memory. She felt the familiar burn in her lungs, the same as Syria, the same helpless awareness that every decision balanced between life and loss. Ramirez climbed up to her position, breathing hard. "You saved our asses, Lieutenant." She shook her head. "We all did what we had to." He looked at her for a long second. "You did more than that." Back at base, the team moved slower, quieter. The adrenaline had burned off, leaving only the weight of what could have been. Bryn sat outside her tent, cleaning her rifle under the stars. The night smelled of dust and spent brass. Ramirez joined her, 2 cups of instant coffee in hand. "You remind me of someone," he said. "First platoon leader I had in Iraq, quiet, never raised her voice. But when things went bad, she was the calm in the room." Bryn smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I'm that calm." "You were tonight." They sat in silence for a while, sipping coffee. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, a jackal barked. Finally, Ramirez spoke again. "You ever think about why you came back?" She stared at the ground. "Because hiding wasn't peace, it was just quieter guilt." He nodded, understanding. When the mission ended 3 weeks later, the team boarded the transport home. Bryn stared out at the red horizon, the wind whipping through the open ramp. The desert below looked endless, indifferent. For the first time since Syria, she didn't feel like she was running from something. Back at Coronado, word had already spread. What she'd done in Somalia, the calm call for fire support, the precision under chaos, people talked. Not loudly, but with respect. The skepticism faded. The introductions became easier. Lieutenant Takakota turned into Bryn during conversations. But she stayed humble, quiet, because she knew what respect really cost. When her grandfather died 6 months later, she took leave and flew home to the reservation. The air was cold, the pines heavy with snow. Her brother handed her the folded flag, voice breaking as he said, "He kept your photo near his bed, you know. Said you were the proof the line didn't end with him." She opened the flag later that night, alone by the window. The photograph was old, edges worn. Her graduation day, eyes bright, trident gleaming. She didn't cry, she just whispered, "You were right, respect isn't given." Outside, the wind carried snow across the hills, and the silence felt sacred. Sometimes redemption doesn't arrive in grand gestures or applause. Sometimes it comes quietly, through endurance, through pain, through the soft return of purpose. And in that quiet, Bryn Takakota finally understood what her grandfather meant all along. Dignity doesn't shout. It just stands its ground. Why did silence feel heavier after she came home? The flight from Washington back to Coronado was quiet, almost empty. Bryn stared out the window as the plane cut through layers of cloud. Below, the land unrolled like memory, mountains fatting into desert, rivers winding through valleys that looked endless from above. But the view didn't calm her. It only reminded her how far she drifted from everything that once felt like home. Her grandfather's funeral had left her hollow, not broken, just unanchored. She stood at his grave while the snow fell, listening to the priest's voice dissolve into the wind. Her brother had wept openly. She couldn't. The tears didn't come. They rarely did anymore. The day after, she'd walked the woods alone, tracing the old trails they used to hunt. The air was thin, pine-scented, and sharp against her lungs. She found one of their old marker stones, half buried, worn smooth by years of rain. She touched it and whispered, "You were right, Granddad. Respect is earned in silence." Now, as the plane descended toward San Diego, she realized she'd never said goodbye properly. Maybe because she didn't know how. Back on base, things looked the same but felt different. The sounds of Coronado, the clang of weights, the calls on the loudspeakers, the smell of salt and diesel had once filled her with energy. Now they only echoed. She was different, and everyone could feel it. Ramirez met her at the hangar. "You sure you're ready to be back?" he asked. Bryn nodded. "I'm fine, sir." It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't the whole truth. Over the next weeks, she buried herself in work, training cycles, equipment checks, range days. If she kept moving, she didn't have to think. But the quiet moments before dawn, after lights out, were the hardest. That's when she'd hear the echoes, the sound of gunfire from Syria, the cries of her team under fire, her grandfather's voice telling her to breathe steady. One night after everyone had gone, she stayed behind in the armory, reassembling rifles that didn't need cleaning. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. The repetition was comforting. Metal, oil, click, repeat. "Couldn't sleep either," a voice said. She looked up. It was Petty Officer Dylan Brooks, one of the younger operators, maybe 25, lanky, sharp-eyed, with that restless confidence she remembered from her own early days. "Something like that," she said. He leaned against the workbench. "Heard about your grandfather, I'm sorry." Bryn nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Brooks hesitated, then asked, You ever think about leaving it behind, all of this?" She set the rifle down. "You mean the job?" "Yeah, the noise, the ghosts." She met his gaze. "Every day. But then I remember, this isn't about me. It's about the ones who don't come home. If I walk away, I lose the part of me that still honors them." He was quiet after that. Then he said softly, "Guess that's why they respect you." She almost smiled, almost. In the following months, Team 3 rotated back into training status. Bryn was assigned as instructor for the next batch of candidates cycling through pre-deployment assessments. The irony wasn't lost on her. After everything, she'd become the person she once feared most, the observer, the evaluator. But maybe, she thought, that was what her grandfather would have wanted, to pass something on. The first day she walked into the training bay, the recruits went still. None of them expected a woman to lead. The hesitation was almost physical. Bryn didn't raise her voice. She just said, "You have one job, learn to trust each other faster than the world can hurt you." They listened. Over the next weeks, she ran them hard. Not through punishment but precision. She corrected posture. She made them repeat movements until they were fluid. She taught them the small things no one bothered to emphasize: how to breathe in chaos, how to listen between explosions, how to move without ego. One afternoon, during a stress shoot course, a recruit named Hayes lost focus. He froze mid-drill, weapon trembling slightly. The others shouted at him to move. Bryn stepped forward, calm, voice low. "Breathe," she said. He blinked, tried to steady his grip. She took the rifle from his hands, reloaded it, and fired 3 clean rounds in under 2 seconds. Then she handed it back. "Now you." Hayes swallowed hard, exhaled, and mirrored her rhythm. This time, his shots landed center mass. When the line went cold, he looked at her and whispered, "How do you stay that calm?" She thought of her grandfather, of nights in the woods when every snap of a twig could mean danger. She thought of Syria, of the firefights where panic killed faster than bullets. "You learn not to let fear borrow your focus," she said. He nodded, quiet. By the end of the cycle, the recruits stopped seeing her as a curiosity. They started listening, watching, learning, and in their faces she saw flickers of who she used to be: hungry, raw, desperate to prove something. Late one evening, as the sun dropped behind the bay, she sat on the dock, boots off, feet dangling above the water. The sky burned orange and violet. The base was quiet for once. She could almost imagine peace. Moss found her there. He sat beside her without asking. Heard you're shaping those kids into killers. She smiled faintly. Into professionals, there's a difference. He nodded. They say you don't yell much. Doesn't work for everyone. Fear fades fast, respect lasts. Moss looked at her, studying her expression. You know, when you came back, I wasn't sure how you'd handle it. Thought maybe you'd keep hiding behind the desk. But I see it now. You needed to come home to the work. She looked out over the water. Maybe I needed to prove to myself I still belonged here. You do, he said simply. The words landed heavier than he meant them to. For the first time in years, she believed it. Weeks later, an unexpected email hit her inbox, an invitation to speak at the Naval Academy's Leadership Symposium. She almost ignored it. Public speaking wasn't her thing, but Ramirez caught wind and insisted. It's not about speeches, he said. It's about showing them what quiet leadership looks like. She went. Standing at that podium in front of rows of cadets in dress whites, she felt her hands shake for the first time in a long while. Not from fear, but from the weight of being seen again. She spoke slowly, carefully, not about glory, not about violence, about endurance. Strength, she said, isn't loud. It's doing your job when no one claps. It's standing alone and still believing you're enough. It's letting your actions be your argument. When she finished, the hall stayed silent for a beat. Then applause rose, not thunderous but genuine. Afterward, a young woman approached her, eyes bright with that same spark Bryn once carried. Ma'am, she said, I'm applying for Bud S next year. Everyone keeps telling me I can't, but you did. Bryn studied her, the earnestness, the hunger, the fear she was trying to hide. She smiled softly. Then you already know what it takes. The cadet frowned. What's that? To keep going when they stop believing in you. For a moment the world felt smaller, simpler, one generation handing quiet courage to another. On the flight back to California, Bryn sat by the window, head resting against the glass. The sunset lit the wing gold. Somewhere below, the ocean shimmered like a sheet of steel. She thought about the mess hall again. Those 5 recruits, the shock on their faces when they realized who she was. It didn't feel like triumph anymore, just a chapter in a story about persistence. The kind of story that never made headlines. Back at base, life rolled on. Missions came, missions went. Some days were long, some were longer. But somewhere in all that repetition, peace began to settle, not as absence of conflict, but as understanding. She visited the training bay often, sometimes just to watch. When recruits faltered, she'd step in quietly, guide their breathing, correct their stance, never shouting, always calm. Word spread through the base, not as gossip, just quiet respect. If you asked anyone about Lieutenant Takakota, they'd tell you she didn't talk much, but when she did, you listened. That she could dismantle a man twice her size but preferred to teach him how not to fall in the first place. And sometimes, late at night when the corridors were empty and the world was still, she'd take out the trident from her drawer. She didn't hide it anymore. It sat on her desk under the lamp, a small glint of gold catching the light. She'd sit beside it with a cup of coffee, remembering faces, those lost, those saved, those still fighting their quiet wars. She didn't need medals. She didn't need to be called a pioneer. What she needed was this, to know that in her silence she'd built something lasting. On the anniversary of her grandfather's passing, she drove north again. The woods were greener now, alive with spring. She walked the same trail, stopped by the same stone, and placed the trident on top. I don't need it to remember, she whispered, but I think you'd want it here. The wind stirred the branches. Somewhere in the distance, an eagle cried. She stood there a long time, eyes closed, breathing in the scent of pine and soil. When she finally turned back toward the trail, there was no ache in her chest, just a quiet steadiness. Because she'd learned what redemption really meant. It wasn't about erasing pain, it was about carrying it with grace. And somewhere between the noise of battle and the silence of loss, Bryn Takakota had found her peace. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the silence before a mission always feel like confession? The orders came without warning, just a coded message from command. Stand by for deployment. No details, no location, just the familiar hum of secrecy that always preceded something heavy. Within 12 hours, Bryn Takakota was on a transport heading east, seated among men who had stopped asking questions long ago. The hum of the C-130 filled the cabin. Red lights flickered against their faces, painting shadows that looked almost sacred. Bryn stared at the floor, her hands resting on her rifle. She didn't pray anymore, not in the way she once did, but she still believed in small rituals. Tighten the sling. Check the safety. Breathe in for 4 counts, out for 6. They landed in darkness. The air outside was hot, dry, and carried the bitter tang of fuel. A convoy waited 2 armored SUVs, lights off. The landscape around them was nothing but sand and wind. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled, or maybe it was artillery. Ramirez briefed them inside the lead vehicle. Joint operation. Local forces, limited support. Target is a rogue cell operating out of a border settlement. Intelligence suggests they're holding civilians. We go in clean, minimal footprint. Confirm and extract. He looked around the vehicle. No heroics, we're ghosts in, ghosts out. Bryn nodded, but her gut twisted. There was always a word missing in briefings like that. Why? They reached the forward base near dawn. The camp was quiet, tension heavy in the air. A local commander, nervous, underfed, eyes ringed with exhaustion, met them with maps printed on weathered paper. Bryn read the coordinates, the pattern of structures, the possible exits. It was all routine, until she saw the secondary note in the margin, children present. Her stomach sank. She waited until the room cleared before approaching Ramirez. You saw the note. He nodded, grim. We don't know how many. Intel's unclear, but command wants confirmation before we escalate. And if they're there, then we adapt. He didn't have to say more. She'd been on missions like this before, where rules of engagement felt thinner than air. That night they prepped in silence. Bryn checked her gear 3 times, then a 4th. Her mind wouldn't quiet. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of her grandfather, of the villagers in Syria, of the cadet who told her she was applying for Bud S. She had promised herself that all of this, the endless rotations, the sleepless nights, meant something. That it wasn't just killing ghosts to keep new ones from forming. But the line was blurring again. They moved out at 200. The world was still, black sky stretched over endless desert. The trucks cut engines a mile out. The team continued on foot. Bryn's heartbeat slowed into rhythm with her steps. Breathe, move, scan. The compound appeared out of the dark, 3 mud brick buildings, faint lamplight leaking through cracks. Through her thermal scope, she saw movement inside. 6, maybe 7 heat signatures. 2 larger, 4 smaller. Children. She keyed her mic. Visual on non-combatants, 4 small bodies, east building. Ramirez cursed under his breath. Copy, maintain overwatch. Seconds later, gunfire erupted, short, chaotic bursts. Bryn froze, finger hovering over her trigger. Who fired? Static crackled, then a strained voice came back. Local partner element, jumped early. Her stomach clenched. She shifted her aim, searching for angles, anything that would make sense. Figures scrambled inside the main structure. Screams pierced the night, one adult, then another, then smaller voices. Bryn's training screamed to stay disciplined, but her body was already moving. She slid down the ridge, boots hitting sand, rifle tight against her shoulder. She reached the doorway just as Ramirez and Brooks cleared the corner. Inside, chaos, dust and gunpowder thick in the air, 2 militants down, one wounded, and in the far corner, 3 children huddled behind a woman clutching them close. Bryn lowered her weapon immediately. "We're here to help," she said, voice steady, calm. The woman didn't move. Her eyes were wide, wild with terror. Bryn stepped closer, slow, hands open. Behind her, one of the local fighters shouted something she couldn't understand and raised his rifle toward the woman. Bryn didn't think, she moved. Her hand snapped up, pushing his barrel aside. The shot went wide, shattering a lantern instead of a life. Ramirez's voice cut through the smoke, cold and sharp. "Stand down." The man hesitated, shouting again in his language, angry, defensive. Bryn didn't care. She stepped between him and the woman, voice low but cutting through the noise. "If you shoot her, you answer to me." The tension was electric. Finally, Ramirez barked an order and the local lowered his weapon. The moment stretched, then broke like glass. They escorted the civilians out. The woman clutched one of Bryn's sleeves the entire way, whispering prayers under her breath. When they reached the trucks, the horizon was turning gray. Another day beginning. Another mission blurring into memory. Back at base, debriefing was clinical, detached. Command wanted results, not context. The local partner unit claimed the civilians were collateral. Bryn stayed silent through most of it, jaw tight. Afterward, Ramirez pulled her aside. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Then why does it feel like I disobeyed something?" "Because right doesn't always look like regulation." That night, she sat outside the tent, watching the horizon. The children's faces kept flashing through her mind. The way the woman had held onto her sleeve as if it was the only solid thing in the world. For the first time in a long while, Bryn felt the old weight again. The guilt that came from surviving places that left no clean choices. Brooks approached quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee that tasted like burnt dust. "Heard you stepped in tonight." She didn't respond. He sat down beside her. "You saved lives, that counts for something." "Maybe," she murmured, "but I keep wondering, how many times does doing the right thing depend on who's writing the report?" He didn't answer, neither did the wind. Weeks later, when they returned stateside, she couldn't shake it. The mission was logged as a success. The rescued civilians were relocated. The numbers looked good, but the silence between lines told another story, one she couldn't file away. Command offered her a commendation. She refused it. Ramirez asked why. She said, "Because medals don't weigh enough to balance what it costs." He didn't argue, he just nodded. Months passed. Life on base settled into rhythm again. Training, paperwork, new faces cycling in. But Bryn felt the shift inside her growing. The work still mattered, but something else was calling, something quieter. One afternoon, Moss found her in the gym, running the obstacle course alone. Sweat drenched her uniform. Her movements were automatic, punishing. "You trying to outrun something, Lieutenant?" he asked. She stopped, breathing hard, just keeping sharp. He gave her a long look. "You're not the only one who's had to choose between orders and conscience." "I didn't disobey." "I didn't say you did, but I've seen that look before. The one that says you left a part of yourself out there." She wiped sweat from her face. "Maybe I did." He nodded. "Then go find it before this job burns the rest away." That night, Bryn wrote a letter she never sent, to the woman from the compound, to the children she never knew by name. It wasn't apology, it was promise. That she'd carry their faces into every decision from now on, that their fear would become her compass. Then she folded the paper, placed it inside her journal, and locked it away. Weeks later, she found herself standing before the same recruits she'd trained months before, now preparing for their first deployments. She looked at their faces, young, eager, untouched by the kind of weight she carried. She told them something she'd never said aloud before. "Courage isn't pulling a trigger," she began softly. "It's the moment you decide whose life is worth more, yours or someone else's, and choosing right even when it costs you." No one spoke. The room was still. Later, one of the recruits approached her privately. "Ma'am," he said, "how do you know what the right choice is out there?" Bryn thought of the compound, the woman's eyes, the children's screams, the deafening silence after the gunfire stopped. "You don't," she said. "You just live with it." When he walked away, she stood there a while, the words echoing back in her mind. Maybe that was the truth of it. There were no clean lines, only choices that scarred differently. That night she sat on her bunk, staring at the trident on her desk. For years it had been a symbol of strength. Now it felt like something else, responsibility, heavy and unrelenting. Her grandfather's voice surfaced again, distant but clear. "The world won't always let you be both a warrior and a protector, but try anyway." She smiled faintly, still trying, Granddad. Outside, the base lights flickered against the dark ocean. Somewhere, a bell rang for midnight watch. She looked at the reflection of the trident under the lamp, the way its gold shimmered against the steel. It reminded her of something she'd nearly forgotten. That honor wasn't in the fight itself, but in the restraint between strikes. For the first time in months, she felt calm. Not peace, just calm. Enough to believe she could keep walking this narrow path between violence and mercy. Because maybe that was her mission now. Not to prove she could fight, but to prove she could still feel. And in a world that rewarded noise, Bryn Takakota kept choosing silence. Because silence, when earned through courage, wasn't weakness, it was grace. Why did they look at her like she was more than human? Bryn Takakota stood on the parade ground beneath a burning California sun, rows of new operators assembled before her. The air shimmered with heat, sweat, and expectation. Every man there had heard her name by now. The quiet SEAL, the one who'd stood her ground in the mess hall, the one who saved civilians in the Horn of Africa. She could see it in their eyes, the half-worship, half-curiosity. They didn't see her as flesh and fatigue. They saw a story. And that scared her. Because stories never show the tremor in your hand after the noise stops. Commander Ramirez had pushed for her promotion, assistant team leader, a slot that came with both trust and isolation. Leadership, she'd learned, wasn't about being followed. It was about standing alone long enough for others to find courage in your shadow. That night, as the sun dropped behind the hangars, she stayed behind after the ceremony. The field was empty except for the flag flapping faintly in the wind. She stared at it for a long time. Then she whispered to no one, "Don't make me a myth. I'm still learning how to breathe." The next mission came fast. East Africa again, different valley, same dust. This time Bryn wasn't just a participant. She was in command, 12 operators, one objective. Intelligence pointed to a small militant faction moving weapons through a mountain corridor. On paper, it looked straightforward: intercept, confiscate, extract. But nothing about war was ever straightforward. They deployed under moonlight, dropping by helicopter into the highlands. The air smelled of iron and rain. As they moved along the ridgeline, Bryn felt the same pulse she always did before contact, part dread, part focus, part strange stillness. Halfway through the approach, Brooks, her old trainee, now her second in command, whispered, "You sure about this path, ma'am? Feels narrow." She scanned the map. "It's the only route with cover. Stay close." The team advanced single file, boots silent on loose stone. Below them, the valley stretched dark and endless. When the ambush came, it was almost elegant in its precision. The first shot shattered the night, then another and another. Muzzle flashes bloomed from the cliffs. The team dove for cover, returning fire. Bryn's voice cut through the chaos, calm, deliberate. "Two shooters west ridge, shift right, flank pattern Charlie." They moved as trained, fluid, mechanical. She coordinated their positions, minds split between strategy and survival. But as the minutes dragged, it became clear they were pinned. The exit route was blocked. Brooks crawled up beside her. "We're low on ammo." "How many wounded?" "3 minor, 1 bad." Harper took a round through the shoulder. Bryn's jaw clenched. She scanned the terrain again, then spotted a gap in the ridge, narrow and steep, barely visible. "We can move through there." Brooks frowned. "That's a fall waiting to happen." "Better than waiting to die here." She called it over the radio. The team shifted, dragging the wounded, covering each other with short bursts. Bryn took rear guard, firing controlled rounds to keep the enemy's heads down. The escape was brutal, rocks giving way under boots, the sound of gunfire echoing off stone. But they made it through, breathless, scraped, alive. When they finally reached the extraction point, Bryn collapsed behind a boulder, chest heaving. Her hands shook as she reloaded. Adrenaline kept her upright until the helicopter's rotors roared overhead. Hours later, in the field hospital, she stood beside Harper's cot. He was pale but stable. "You did good, Lieutenant," he murmured. She nodded, voice tight. "You'll be fine." But inside she was. The mission report called it a success. Minimal casualties. Objective achieved. Yet she couldn't shake the image of that narrow escape, the way luck, not leadership, had saved them. Back at Coronado, the story spread anyway. Takakota led them through hell. She doesn't break. She wanted to scream, "I do break, I just don't show it where you can see." At night, she began running the beach again. No music, no lights, just the sound of surf and the rhythm of her own breath. The ocean had always been her teacher, merciless but honest. One evening, Moss joined her halfway through a run. His pace matched hers easily, though he was older, slower in years but still relentless in spirit. "They're already calling you the Iron Lieutenant," he said between breaths. Bryn snorted. "Then they've never seen me cry in a motel shower after a deployment." He smiled. "None of us are as strong as the rumors say." They ran in silence a while before Moss added, "You ever think about what comes next, after this life?" She didn't answer immediately. The question lingered, heavy as the sea air. "I don't know," she said finally. "Every time I plan for later, the world gives me another reason to stay in it." "Maybe that's your curse," he said softly, "or maybe it's your purpose." She didn't know the difference anymore. Weeks later, she was summoned to brief senior command. A visiting admiral wanted her perspective on mixed-gender integration in combat units. The irony wasn't lost on her, years of trying to disappear, and now they wanted her as a face for progress. She wore her uniform perfectly, her trident gleaming under the fluorescent light. The admiral asked polished questions. She gave measured answers. But when he said, "You must be proud to represent what's possible for women in special operations," something in her chest twisted. "I'm proud to represent what's possible for anyone who refuses to quit, sir," she said quietly. He smiled, oblivious to the exhaustion behind her words. After the meeting, she walked outside into the blinding sun, shoulders tense. The noise of traffic from the base gate filled the air, sharp and ordinary. For the first time, she felt like she was standing between two worlds, the myth they wanted and the woman she actually was. That night, Brooks stopped by her office. "We got new orders. Humanitarian support mission, flooded region, local unrest, non-combat." She looked up. "Non-combat doesn't exist." He smiled faintly. "True, but it's a chance to breathe." She almost laughed. "Breathing overrated." Still, she agreed. They deployed 2 weeks later to a coastal region torn by storms and political chaos. Their job was simple: evacuate civilians, secure aid routes, stabilize what could be stabilized. For once there were no gunfights, just exhaustion, mud, crying children, villages half submerged. Bryn found herself knee-deep in the work, literally hauling sandbags, directing helicopters, translating through gestures. She barely slept. One night, while guiding an evac convoy, she spotted an old man trapped on a roof. The floodwaters were rising fast. No time for ropes or plans. She stripped her gear, dove in, and swam hard against the current. By the time she reached him, her arms burned. She grabbed his wrist, pulled him onto a floating door, and kicked until the rescue boat found them. Later, soaked and shivering, she sat on the edge of the dock while medics worked behind her. Brooks tossed her a blanket. "You never stop, do you?" She shrugged. "If I stop moving, I start thinking." He nodded. "Then keep moving, ma'am, but someday you're gonna have to rest." She didn't answer. Days turned into nights. The flood subsided. The evac numbers climbed. By the end, they'd saved hundreds. No medals, no headlines, just quiet relief. When the last helicopter lifted off, Bryn stood in the rain, watching the horizon fade. She felt something new then, not adrenaline, not grief. Peace, maybe. The kind that comes when you realize saving lives doesn't always require a weapon. Back in San Diego, the media got hold of the story anyway. Navy SEAL rescues dozens during flood relief. Lieutenant Takakota leads humanitarian mission. She turned off the TV halfway through the broadcast. Ramirez found her later. "They're talking about giving you a commendation again." She sighed. "Let them, but don't make me attend another ceremony." He smiled. "You're terrible at being famous." "I'm not famous," she said. "I'm just tired." After he left, she stood by the window, looking at the lights over the bay. Her reflection stared back, calm, older, scarred. Somewhere deep down, she knew she couldn't do this forever. The deployments, the expectations, the weight of proving that strength had no gender. But she also knew she wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. Because there were still recruits who needed someone to show them how to stand. There were still missions that required quiet steadiness instead of noise. That night she opened her journal, the same one that held the unsent letter. She wrote, "Legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about leaving a place gentler than you found it." Then she closed it, turned off the light, and finally slept without dreams. The next morning she rose before dawn. The air was cool, the ocean calm. She jogged along the sand, the horizon just beginning to blush with sunlight. She thought of her grandfather, of Syria, of the mess hall, of every line of doubt she'd crossed to get here. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was running from ghosts. She was running toward something. Toward balance, toward peace, toward a version of herself that didn't need to prove anything anymore. The waves hissed against the shore, and the wind carried her breath away into the rising sun. Sometimes strength isn't in the fight, she thought. It's in the grace to lead without needing to be followed. And in that quiet, between heartbeat and horizon, Bryn Takakota finally understood what kind of leader she'd become. Not the myth they whispered about. Just human, steady, flawed, and still standing. Why did it always take one mistake to remind her how fragile command really was? The new rotation started quietly. Training, briefings, dry runs. Nothing dramatic. Just the slow, steady rhythm of preparation that lulls everyone into a fragile sense of safety. Bryn Takakota had begun to feel something close to balance again. The flood mission had changed her, not in the way action did, but in the way silence does. It had reminded her that the world wasn't always an enemy to outfight. Sometimes, it just needed a steady hand. But the world, as always, had other plans. Her team had been assigned a series of readiness drills, urban movement, breaching, close quarters battle. It was meant to keep them sharp before their next overseas rotation. The newest member of her unit was Petty Officer Kyle Mercer, 23, bright, fast, and reckless. The kind of soldier who reminded Bryn of everything she'd once been before loss carved out the noise inside her. Mercer was talented, no question. But talent without humility was a fuse waiting to burn too fast. "Slow is smooth," she told him during their first live-fire drill. "Smooth is fast, you don't rush precision." He grinned under his helmet. "Ma'am, I got it." She frowned. "You think you got it, you don't yet." He didn't mean harm. He just hadn't failed big enough to know what failure cost. The exercise took place in a mock village outside the base, a training compound made of plywood walls and empty rooms that smelled faintly of oil and sweat. The mission was simple: breach, clear, extract a simulated hostage. Bryn led from the rear that day, letting the younger operators take point. Mercer was assigned to entry 2. His movements were crisp at first, clean angles, tight formations. But adrenaline is a liar, and overconfidence blinds faster than fear. She heard the mistake before she saw it, the double tap of gunfire in the wrong direction, followed by a shouted curse. "Cease fire, cease fire." Her heart dropped. She rounded the corner. A training role player, a local civilian actor, was on the ground clutching his shoulder. The rounds were sim rounds, meant to sting, not kill, but they'd hit high, close to the neck. Bryn knelt immediately, calling for the medics. The man's eyes were wide, panicked. Blood trickled through the suit seams where the round had torn skin. Mercer froze, rifle slack at his side. "I thought I saw movement, She cut him off. "You didn't confirm your target." His mouth opened, then closed. He looked like a child suddenly realizing fire burns. The medics rushed in, stabilizing the injured actor. He'd be fine. A few stitches, maybe a scar, but Bryn knew it wasn't the wound that mattered. It was what came after. Training accidents like this were supposed to be routine, documented, reviewed, corrected. But they never were routine. Not for the person who pulled the trigger. Not for the leader who let them. That night, the after-action report sat open on Bryn's desk. She stared at the blank section labeled Commanding Officer's Remarks. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. How do you write that you saw it coming? That you tried to warn him but couldn't stop the inevitable? She typed slowly, deliberately. Operator displayed lapse in threat discrimination due to overconfidence under simulated stress. Corrective training recommended. Responsibility for oversight remains with leadership. She signed her name. The next morning, Ramirez called her into his office. "Mercer, been suspended from live fire for now," he said. "Medical says the role player's fine. No permanent damage." Bryn nodded. "You did what you could, Lieutenant. These things happen." She looked at him. "They happen because we forget how fast good men can make bad calls." He sighed. "You're too hard on yourself." "Someone has to be." Ramirez studied her a moment, then said quietly, "You ever notice how you take responsibility for everyone else's ghosts?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Later that day, she found Mercer in the armory, sitting alone on a crate, helmet off, staring at the floor. He looked young in a way she hadn't noticed before, the kind of young that still believed failure was the end, not the lesson. He stood as she entered. "Ma'am, I just want to say." "Sit." He obeyed. She leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "You made a mistake." "Yes, ma'am." "You could have killed someone." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I know." She let the silence hang heavy, punishing. Then she said quietly, "So what are you going to do with it?" He looked up, confused. "Do with it?" "Yeah, you can drown in it, or you can learn from it. Only one of those gets you back in the fight." His eyes shimmered, jaw tight. "How do you carry it, ma'am, the things you've seen?" She hesitated. The question landed deeper than he knew. "You don't carry it," she said softly. "You just learn to walk with it." He nodded, silent tears threatening but held back by pride. After that, Mercer changed. The cockiness faded. He moved slower, thought before he spoke. The others noticed. Respect shifted. It wasn't about strength anymore, it was about awareness. Weeks passed. The report faded into archives, but the memory didn't. Bryn watched him during drills, proud in ways she didn't say aloud. One evening, during a night exercise, Mercer approached her quietly. Permission to speak off record. She raised an eyebrow. Granted. He hesitated. You ever wonder if some of us just aren't built for this? That no matter how hard we try, we're not ready? She took a slow breath. All of us wonder that. The ones who stop wondering are the ones who scare me. He nodded. I don't want to be the guy who freezes when it counts. You already aren't, she said. Freezing isn't about fear. It's about not knowing who you are when everything breaks. You faced that already. You survived it. That's what readiness looks like. He smiled faintly. Thanks, ma'am. After he walked away, she stayed under the stars for a while, listening to the distant hum of generators. For the first time since the incident, she felt something close to relief. Not because the problem was solved, but because she'd found meaning inside it. Leadership wasn't about perfection. It was about guiding people through the kind of failure that once nearly broke you. 2 weeks later, the team was sent to a classified training exchange with Allied forces overseas, part of a joint readiness initiative. It was meant to be routine. It was. The training area was high altitude, mountainous terrain, unpredictable weather. On the third day, a sudden storm rolled in, visibility near zero. They were halfway through a navigation exercise when Bryn realized Mercer was missing. "Where's Mercer?" she called over the comms. "Static." Her chest tightened. She scanned the ridgeline, snow whipping, fog rising. Then she saw a faint shape below, a man sliding, tumbling. "Mercer." She didn't think, she went after him. The slope was steep, the snow treacherous. She half slid, half fell, digging her boots into the ice until she reached him. He was conscious but dazed, leg twisted at a bad angle. "Don't move," she said, kneeling beside him. He groaned. I slipped." "Yeah, no kidding." He managed a weak smile. The radio crackled. Brooks's voice cut through. "We've got your signal, ma'am, 10 mics out." "Copy, he's hurt but stable. I'll hold here." The minutes dragged. Wind screamed across the ridge. Bryn pulled her jacket tighter around Mercer, shielding him from the cold. He looked up at her, eyes glassy from pain. "I screwed up again." She shook her head. "You fell, that's gravity, not guilt." He tried to laugh but coughed instead. "Still your responsibility though, right?" Her throat tightened. "No, this one's on the mountain." When the rescue team arrived, they lifted him carefully onto a stretcher. As they carried him away, he grabbed her sleeve, just like that mother had in the compound months before, and whispered, "You were right. You do learn to walk with it." She watched him disappear into the white blur, and something inside her cracked open. Later, back at the tent, Ramirez found her sitting alone, boots off, staring at the snow melting off her gloves. "He's gonna make it," Ramirez said. "Broken tibia, lucky it wasn't worse." Bryn nodded. "Luck's all that keeps us alive some days." He studied her a moment. "You did good." She looked up, voice quiet. "I didn't do anything heroic, I just didn't leave him behind." He smiled faintly. "That's what heroism looks like most days." That night, Bryn wrote again in her journal. Leadership isn't about saving people from mistakes. It's about walking beside them when they fall. She closed the notebook, listening to the wind howl outside. For once, it didn't sound like chaos. It sounded like movement, like time carrying her forward. The next morning, she stood at the edge of camp, watching the sunrise spill over the peaks. The light touched the snow, turning it gold. She realized something then. The myth they'd built around her wasn't real, but maybe it didn't have to be. Maybe myths existed to remind others what was possible, not because you were unbreakable, but because you broke and kept standing anyway. When the team returned home, Mercer limped into the hangar weeks later, smiling sheepishly on crutches. The room erupted in cheers. He spotted her across the bay and saluted. She returned it, no words needed. In that moment, Bryn Takakota understood something simple and sacred about leadership. Something no medal, no briefing, no order could teach. Forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was command, because only those who'd forgiven themselves could lead others through their own storms. And she, finally, had learned to forgive herself. The world outside was waking up, engines starting, waves breaking against the pier, the faint hum of a flag rising up a pole. She stood there a long time, the ocean breeze tugging at her uniform, her eyes on the horizon. Sometimes, the bravest thing a soldier can do isn't fight. It's stay. Stay to teach, stay to guide, stay to remind others that failure isn't fatal if you keep moving through it. The trident on her chest gleamed in the dawn light, not as armor anymore, but as reflection. Of where she'd been, of who she'd become, of what still mattered. Why did the quiet moments feel heavier than gunfire? Months had passed since the mountain rescue, but Bryn Takakota still felt the echoes in her bones. Her body healed fast, her mind didn't bother pretending anymore. The mission reports were filed, the team debriefed, and Mercer was walking again. Everything had returned to normal, or whatever passed for normal in the life of someone who never really stopped serving. But there was something new now, a restlessness, a question she didn't know how to answer. The Navy had sent her notice, routine administrative updates buried beneath the noise of emails. One line caught her eye, eligible for early retirement consideration. She stared at it for a long time, unreadable expression reflected on the monitor. Retirement. It felt like a foreign word, like something that belonged to someone older, softer, done with battle. She was only 32, but years in the teams aged you faster than calendars did. Later that evening, Ramirez found her sitting alone in the gym, wrapping her hands for a sparring session that wasn't going to happen. "You get the notice too?" he asked. She looked up. "Yeah." "You thinking about it?" She shrugged. "Thinking as far as I've gotten." He nodded. "You've done more than most ever will. Nobody would blame you for walking away." "Would you?" Ramirez smiled faintly. "No, but I know you won't." She wanted to argue, but he wasn't wrong. That night she went running along the beach again. The wind whipped her hair loose, the surf crashing hard against the shore. She kept pace until her lungs burned, until her body hurt enough to drown the noise in her head. But even exhaustion couldn't quiet it. That small, stubborn question pulsing beneath everything. If not this, then what? The next week, command called her in for a briefing. It wasn't routine. She could tell by the tone of the summons, the way the guard at the door saluted a little sharper than usual. Inside, Commander Dalton was waiting, the same man who'd reinstated her to the teams years before. He hadn't changed much, except for deeper lines around the eyes and a weight in his posture that came only with time and command. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Lieutenant Takakota." "Sir?" He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I'm going to make this simple. The Office of Naval Special Warfare Command is forming a new composite task unit, small, cross-branch, high discretion. We want you to lead it." She blinked at me. "You've proven you can handle complex dynamics, male and female operators, multinational teams, high ethics under pressure. That's what this unit needs. You'd have full operational authority." Bryn leaned back slightly. "And the catch?" He smiled. "There's always a catch, isn't there? The tempo will be brutal, the risk high, you'd be gone more than home, and you'd have to decide whether this next phase is still the life you want." She was quiet for a long moment. "And if I say no?" "Then we process your retirement. You've earned the right to rest." She nodded slowly. Dalton's voice softened. "You don't have to decide today, but I'll tell you this, Lieutenant. There are very few people I trust to lead something like this, and fewer still who can do it without losing their humanity along the way." She didn't know what to say. When she left his office, the air outside felt heavier, like the world had tilted slightly. The ocean stretched out in front of the base, indifferent, eternal. She walked to the railing, the metal cool beneath her palms. Peace or purpose? Rest or the relentless motion that kept her alive? That night she couldn't sleep. The sound of helicopters in the distance stirred her like ghosts calling her name. She got up, sat by the window, and opened her journal. The last page she'd written said, "Forgiveness is command." Below it she wrote, "But command without peace is a slow death." She closed it, exhaled, and watched the city lights shimmer on the water. 2 days later she drove north to the reservation where she'd grown up. She hadn't been back since her grandfather's funeral. The roads were cracked, the forests familiar. The air smelled of pine and dust. Her brother met her at the old cabin, surprised but smiling. "Didn't expect you," he said. "Didn't expect me either," she replied. They sat on the porch that night, sharing silence instead of stories. It was easier that way. Words felt too small for everything that had passed between then and now. At one point he asked quietly, "You ever gonna quit?" She stared out into the trees. "I thought about it." "And?" She smiled faintly, still thinking. He nodded. "You were always chasing something nobody could see." "Yeah," she said softly, "maybe that's the problem." The next morning she walked the trail to her grandfather's grave. The earth was still damp from rain. She knelt, brushed pine needles off the headstone, and set down a small trident pin. "You'd probably tell me to stop running," she whispered, "but I don't know who I am without it." The wind rustled through the pines, quiet and sure. "I'm tired, Granddad," she said. "Not of the fight, of the noise that comes after." A hawk cried in the distance. For a moment she could almost hear his voice again. "Little hawk, purpose isn't a place you arrive. It's what you carry when the world forgets why you started." She closed her eyes, breathing in the forest air until her heartbeat slowed. When she drove back to Coronado 3 days later, something inside her had settled. Not peace, exactly, but direction. She went straight to Dalton's office. He looked up as she entered. "You've made your decision." "Yes, sir." "And?" She stood straighter. "I'll take it, the task unit." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "I hoped you'd say that." She returned the expression, small but steady. "I didn't do it because it's safe. I did it because someone has to remind the next generation that strength isn't about who yells the loudest." Dalton nodded. "Then let's build something worth following." The months that followed were unlike any before. The new unit, codenamed Vigil Team, was a patchwork of operators from across branches. Marines, Air Force PJs, Navy divers, Army Rangers. Diverse, skilled, unpredictable. Bryn learned their rhythms, their fears, their strengths. She built trust the only way she knew how, by listening more than speaking. In the field she was steady, decisive. Off the field she was quiet, almost withdrawn. But the team felt it, the kind of leadership that didn't demand obedience but inspired it. Their missions were delicate, high-stakes extractions, hostage recoveries, silent interventions in places no news would ever name. Bryn led them through it all, unflinching, composed. But the truth she'd learned still echoed. Peace never lasted long in lives like theirs. On a winter night, during an operation in the Balkans, the team was pinned down by crossfire in a crumbling industrial zone. The mission teetered on collapse. Over the comms, voices rose, panic creeping in. Then Bryn's voice cut through, calm, steady, absolute. "Everyone breathe. You've been here before, stay low, wait for my call." Her tone alone anchored them. Within minutes she coordinated their extraction, guiding them out through smoke and ruin. When the helicopter lifted off, and the team sat in stunned silence, Brooks, now her senior NCO, looked at her with quiet awe. "You never break," he said softly. She looked out the window at the dark horizon. "I do. I just learned how to put the pieces back before morning." They landed at base hours later, cold and covered in grime. Bryn sat alone on the tarmac for a while, the hum of cooling engines filling the night. And there, for the first time in years, she let herself cry. Not from pain, from release. She wasn't the myth they'd built. She wasn't the invincible seal. She was just a human being who'd carried too much for too long and somehow was still here. Later, as dawn crept over the airfield, she wiped her face, stood, and whispered to herself, "You made your choice. Now live it." The horizon glowed gold, the first light touching the edges of her uniform. She walked toward it, steady, unhurried, unafraid. Because purpose wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a whisper you followed into another dawn, one mission at a time. And for Bryn Takakota, that was enough. Why did endings always sound like beginnings when the wind came off the ocean? The orders came one gray morning without fanfare. A final mission. Not officially called that, but Bryn Takakota knew. You always know when something in you is circling toward closure. It was classified deep black. Even her team didn't know the full scope until wheels were already up. A high-value extraction in hostile territory. Intelligence compromise. Minimal support. High risk. The kind of mission that tested not just skill but conviction. As the C-17 shuddered through clouds, Bryn looked around the cabin at the faces of her team. The same men and women she'd trained, scolded, and trusted more than anyone alive. Brooks sat across from her, chewing gum, pretending not to study her. Mercer, now fully recovered, adjusted his weapon, pretending not to notice her gaze. "Everyone good?" she asked over the engine hum. A chorus of nods, nervous but ready. She gave a small smile, "Then let's keep it that way." The red cabin light painted their faces in a surreal calm. Bryn closed her eyes briefly, breathing slow. The same ritual she'd done since her first mission years ago. Not to clear her mind, that never worked, but to remind herself that fear meant she still cared about living. When the wheels touched down on foreign soil, night had already swallowed the horizon. The air was thick, humid, laced with the scent of diesel and rain. They moved fast, quiet, invisible. The objective was a compound on the outskirts of a border city, where an Allied intelligence officer had been captured during a failed operation. The clock was running out. Bryn's orders were clear. Extract, no casualties if possible, but clarity on paper never matched reality on the ground. They advanced under the cover of rain, boots silent on wet earth. Through her scope, Bryn saw the compound walls concrete, topped with rusted wire. 2 guards at the gate, one inside the watchtower. She whispered into comms, marking 3, non-lethal, keep it quiet. Brooks and Mercer moved like ghosts. Within seconds the guards were down, unconscious. The team breached low and silent. Inside, the air smelled of oil and sweat. Bryn led the advance, weapon raised, eyes slicing through the dark. Room by room, they cleared until a sound stopped her. A cry, soft, frightened. She motioned for silence, then followed it down a narrow hallway. Behind a steel door, faint movement, not the captive they came for, something else. She signaled to Brooks. He pried it open just enough for her to look inside. 2 children huddled in the corner, eyes wide. Her stomach twisted. They weren't part of the mission. They weren't even supposed to be there. But the moment she saw them, she knew what would happen if she left them. She keyed her mic. 2 civilians found, young, adjusting plan. Negative, the voice from command replied. Stick to objectives, extraction priority only. Her jaw clenched. They'll die if we leave them, she whispered. Silence crackled back through the comms. Then a curt, understood, you're on your own call. The decision was instant. We're taking them. The team didn't question it. They never did anymore. Minutes later, they found the captured officer bound, bruised, alive. Extraction window closing. The enemy was mobilizing. Gunfire erupted outside the compound before they could exfiltrate. Bryn cursed softly, contact west wall. Rounds tore through the air, sparks flying off metal. The team returned fire, calculated, efficient. She moved through the chaos like muscle memory, low stance, controlled bursts, measured breathing. Brooks yelled over comms, "We're pinned, need another route." Bryn scanned, found the side access, half-collapsed, narrow but clear enough. "This way, go, go, go." They moved fast, dragging the wounded officer and the children. The younger one cried quietly, clutching Bryn's sleeve, the way that mother had years ago in Syria. The sound almost broke her. By the time they reached the extraction zone, the night was alive with noise, gunfire, thunder, the roar of approaching trucks. The helicopter loomed ahead, rotors slicing the rain. "Go," Bryn shouted, "everyone aboard." Brooks turned back, "You first." She shook her head, "Not yet." Mercer grabbed the last child, hoisted him into the bird, then turned to cover her. "Come on, ma'am." She fired one last burst, covering their retreat, then ran. The helicopter lifted just as she leapt, boots catching the skid. Brooks pulled her in. The cabin was chaos, shouting, adrenaline, relief. Bryn dropped to her knees, gasping. The children huddled in the corner, clutching each other. One of them looked up at her and whispered something in a language she didn't understand, but she understood the tone. Gratitude, fear, hope. She smiled weakly. "You're safe now." As the helicopter banked away from the burning city, Bryn looked out the open door. The rain streaked sideways across the dark sky. Her heart was steady but heavy. Every mission left a mark, but this one felt final. Back at base, the debriefing was short, clinical, impersonal, the way bureaucracy always handled miracles. The rescued officer was already being transported home. The children were handed off to humanitarian aid. When it was her turn to speak, Bryn simply said, "We did what was right." Dalton nodded, "You always do." But his eyes held something else, pride mixed with the quiet understanding that this might have been her last run. Later that night, alone in her quarters, Bryn unzipped her duffel and pulled out the trident. She placed it on the desk, the same way she had years ago, back when she still hid it from the world. Only this time, she wasn't hiding. She ran a finger over the metal, tracing its edges. The gold was duller now, worn by time and salt and blood, but it still caught the light, still held the reflection of everything she'd fought to become. She thought of the recruits she'd trained, the teammates she'd lost, the lives she'd saved, the lines she'd crossed. All of it converging into the quiet truth that nothing heroic ever feels heroic while you're doing it. It just feels necessary. Her phone buzzed, a message from Dalton. "We'll need your decision soon. Command or retirement." She stared at it for a long time. Then she typed back, "I've already decided." She turned off the phone and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the distant hum of the ocean through the window. The next morning she walked out onto the pier just as the sun began to rise. The horizon burned gold and pink, the waves catching light like polished steel. She breathed deep, the salt air sharp in her lungs. Footsteps approached behind her. It was Brooks. "Figured I'd find you here," he said. She smiled, old habits. He nodded toward the sunrise. "So, you gonna tell me?" She glanced at him, then back at the horizon. "I'm done, Brooks." He studied her face. Done. She nodded, this time, yeah. He looked like he wanted to argue, but didn't. Instead, he said quietly, "You taught us what right looks like, ma'am. Doesn't go away just because you hang up the uniform." She smiled softly. "Then I did my job." They stood there a while, watching the sun lift over the water. When he left, she stayed. The wind tugged at her sleeves, gentle, familiar. She took the trident from her pocket, warm from her hand, and looked at it one last time. Then she knelt and set it down on the wooden rail, letting the morning light wash over it. It wasn't surrender, it was gratitude. The waves below whispered and broke, steady as breath. She watched until the metal caught the full blaze of sunlight, until her reflection disappeared into it. Somewhere in the sound of the surf, she could almost hear her grandfather again. Dignity doesn't speak, little hawk. It just acts. Bryn stood slowly, the wind brushing her face, the world ahead vast and quiet. She had spent half her life fighting wars, the other half learning which battles weren't worth fighting. And now, finally, she understood. Strength wasn't the absence of fear. It was the courage to walk away with grace when the world still expected you to stay. When she turned from the ocean, she didn't look back. Because everything she needed was already behind her. The missions, the ghosts, the wait, the proving. And everything she wanted was ahead: silence, simplicity, peace earned the hard way. By nightfall, she was gone from the base. No ceremony, no farewell speech, just a quiet departure at dusk, the kind of exit she'd always believed in. Weeks later, on the reservation, her brother found her tending a small patch of earth behind the cabin. Tomatoes, beans, wildflowers. He laughed softly. "Never thought I'd see the day you traded rifles for roots." She looked up, dirt on her hands, eyes bright in the evening light. Maybe they're not so different. Both require patience. Both teach you what to protect. He smiled. "You really done." She nodded. "This time I'm home." They stood together in silence as the sun sank low, the forest glowing amber around them. Somewhere, an eagle called overhead. Bryn looked up, smiled, and whispered, "Still watching, aren't you, Granddad?" The air felt light again, like forgiveness, like rest, like something sacred returning after years of absence. And as the sky dimmed to violet, Bryn Takakota, warrior, leader, survivor, closed her eyes and breathed deeply, finally understanding what all those years of struggle had been leading to. Not victory, not fame, not even redemption. Just peace. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And then quietly it lets go.